Hi, this is the recorded version of our class activity on exposure therapy, where we're going to talk about how to build an exposure hierarchy. So this is an example of what exposure therapy might actually look like and how patients might actually experience it.
I am terribly afraid of cockroaches. When I see one, I become a different person. I sort of become paralyzed. My heart starts racing. I have trouble breathing, and I freak out everybody around me. And I think they are the grossest things on the planet. I met Dr. Frand, and he mentioned exposure therapy. So I thought, I'd try it. He's going to cure me of my fears of roaches.
So whatever happened that made you afraid of this, and I think we talked about this a little bit. Had a bad experience in an apartment that you were renting. It was infested with roaches. They were everywhere. You didn't really feel safe.
Yeah.
And before that, you weren't comfortable with them, but didn't have the same intense fear. Afterwards, now they're pretty scary.
Yes.
All right, are you ready to handle some fake roaches?
Yeah, okay.
All right, hand out. Ready?
I'm so glad. Okay.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh my God.
All right. Okay. Okay, that was fine.
Oh.
That was fine. Yeah.
Thank you. So this was a really good first session. I felt pretty safe, but I was a lot more nervous than I thought I would be. And I'm having trouble like calming down. And then I discovered I was sweating a little. I can't decide if I'm stupid or or if this doesn't make any sense to me right now. I know it makes sense, but right now it doesn't make sense. They look different than I would expect them to.
Come.
I don't know. I guess I never looked that closely.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of part of this too. Is you get to learn a little.
Oh.
Yeah.
Hello. Oh my God. Ew. Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
That's gross.
Would you like to take these guys home with you?
No.
Will you take them home?
Yeah, I'll take them home. Here's the roach. I haven't opened it yet. I've had it in my pocketbook for a week, so it's probably not going to be in very good shape. But we're going to explore. Okay, I can do this. You can do it.
So here's our friend, the roach named Drogon, in his little Chinese food container right now, and he's crawling on this paper towel, and we're going to take the paper towel out. Have Julie handle the paper towel.
I really do feel trapped.
I'm going to do this very slowly.
Oh my God.
Okay. It's just anxiety, right? So you can let that wave of anxiety come over you, and now, how does it feel to have your hand?
Scary.
So Julie did a great job with the previous exposure, which was pretty challenging. And now we're actually going to have her go into this room here, and we're going to let a different roach out. I'm going to be in there with her at first, and then when she's ready, I'm going to come out, and we'll track your level of anxiety all along the way.
Ready.
All right.
Okay.
I think you've been in there for at least 5 minutes.
Okay, it's really hot.
No, it's really hot. Do you want to stop for now?
You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna cup him.
Good.
Okay. I got you.
Julie's exposure therapy experience, I would say, is pretty average. She had a pretty normal course of treatment. She struggled with some things, but that's totally normal. And and she was very brave. And overall, I think that she did a great job. She ended up in a place where she wanted to be, in a place where fear of roaches really doesn't impact her day-to-day life as much as it did before.
This experience with exposure therapy has been incredibly surprising. I really, truly, going into this, never thought that I would make the kind of progress that I have. I can't say that it was fun. I mean, it wasn't terrible all the time, but it was definitely hard. But I really can see the value in it, and I really feel like my life is going to be easier because of it.
All right. Oops. So in that video, what you saw was a patient identifying a feared situation as a specific phobia that incidentally involves both fear and disgust in her response, and creating a series of stepped experiences where she got closer and closer to a situation that she was really afraid of. So she started out with just handling plastic cockroaches, which caused some anxiety, but not the same levels of anxiety that handling a real cockroach or interacting with a real cockroach in a lifelike setting like the stairway of an office building would. Over time, as she got used to engaging in those interactions with cockroaches, and as she habituated to them and lost her fear of them, she went further and further towards the thing that she was really afraid of. And she ended with being able to get all the way to the end of this sort of series of fear exposures. So as you saw for that patient, exposure does work. So this table is the results of a meta-analysis, which is a type of statistical procedure where researchers take results from lots of different studies, lots of different individual patients, and pull them together to create estimates that basically summarize everything that we know about that in the field. So what this is showing is the magnitude of the difference in change in anxiety symptoms between a placebo control condition, either a pill or placebo therapy, and exposure therapy for different anxiety disorders. In the red bars are changes in anxiety, and in the green bars are changes in depression symptoms. And the reason depression is being measured here and being compared to anxiety is that this is showing that not only does exposure work in that it, compared to placebo, creates a lot of change in people's level of anxiety, it also works in a way that's specific to anxiety. So it's not just making people better across the board, it's making them less anxious. As you can see, although it does look like in some of these disorders, exposure therapy does reduce depression. In others, it doesn't change depression significantly. So what this error bar is showing is that even though it looks like there's a big change in depression, when you look at the variability across all the different studies, we can't confidently say that there is any difference between a placebo group and exposure treatment in changing depression. But we can confidently say that exposure works better than placebo in improving people's symptoms of anxiety. So in the last lecture about specific phobias, we talked about how avoidance perpetuates specific phobia. Avoidance is a reinforced behavior because when you avoid a situation that's making you anxious, you escape, you get away from the anxiety, your anxiety levels go down, and reducing anxiety really reinforces the behaviors that are rewarded by that reduced anxiety, like avoidance. The problem is that your nervous system doesn't learn anything from that experience except that all I can do is escape. The next time you encounter that same situation, your anxiety levels are going to be just as high until you escape again. In exposure therapy, our goal is to keep people in that situation, give them the tools that they need and the support that they need to not escape. Just like Julie in that video really wanted to stop handling the roaches. She really wanted to get away from it, but with the help of a therapist, she pushed through that urge, that motivation to escape, and she stayed in the situation. That's an exposure. And over time, after repeatedly exposing yourself to a situation and letting your anxiety decline naturally instead of declining rapidly because of avoidance, the peak level of anxiety, how upset you feel in that situation, gets a little bit lower every time you're in it, until eventually, through exposure, that situation doesn't make you anxious at all anymore. So the main goal of exposure is to remain in a scary situation without avoiding. And what happens when you do that is, in most cases, the thing that you're afraid will happen, the fear that's driving that specific phobia, is actually unlikely. And by not avoiding, by not escaping as soon as you feel that fear, you actually learn that your fear reaction isn't a signal of danger. It's not telling you that anything bad is going to happen. Because if you ignore your fear reaction and stay in the situation, nothing bad does happen. Or if it does, it's not as bad as you thought. Because by definition, phobias are unrealistic and the fear is excessive for the situation. In exposure, we want patients to learn that if they don't escape, if they don't avoid, their fear, anxiety, or disgust will subside on their own eventually. We can't feel anxious or disgusted forever. If the stimulus doesn't change that's causing that emotional reaction, we'll stop having it. That's habituation. In an exposure, we want patients to prove to themselves that they can handle fear and anxiety. Often in specific phobias, what patients will say is not so much that they think there's real danger in the thing that they're afraid of, but they think that they can't handle their anxiety response. They think that they'll fall apart. They think that they'll have a panic attack and die. What they're really afraid of is their own emotional response. And so in an exposure, when they sit with their emotional response and don't do anything to reduce it, they learn that they can handle that level of anxiety. And then lastly, in order to do that, sometimes people have to learn and practice new coping skills, because when avoidance and escaping is your only coping skill, it doesn't give you the opportunity to learn how to handle anxiety, fear, and disgust. So exposure works through two processes. The first is habituation, which we can sort of think of as happening automatically, unconsciously. It's really just a physiological reaction. It's our nervous system losing its response to a stimulus that doesn't change. So fear, disgust, or anxiety that's caused by a stimulus that isn't changing or increasing is naturally going to go away on its own. Our nervous system isn't going to keep having that same fear response to a stimulus that's not changing and not giving us new information. The parasympathetic nervous system's role is to eventually come online and calm down that fear response. We used to think that habituation was kind of the goal of therapy, and we would consider an exposure not successful if the patient didn't experience habituation during the exposure. So like if Julie didn't start to calm down while around a cockroach in, her hour-long therapy session, we used to think that that was an unsuccessful exposure. But what we now know is that habituation is a nervous system process, but it's not new learning. It's just our body losing its sort of natural response because the stimulus isn't changing. What's actually happening in exposure is new learning is forming. Safety or inhibitory learning is taking place, where we learn that even though we're having a big fear response in the presence of this stimulus or in this situation, there's no actual danger. So now we're experiencing a different kind of learning, where we're learning that our fear response doesn't predict danger, and the situation itself doesn't predict danger. So exposure without avoiding helps us to disprove certain expectations. For example, that the feared object or situation is dangerous. In an exposure, we actually learn that it's safe. We learn that the feared outcome is unlikely to happen. Because again, by definition, phobias are unrealistic, excessive fears. Or patients may learn that although fear, disgust, and anxiety feel really uncomfortable, they're not actually dangerous. And if they don't escape and don't avoid, their fear, anxiety, or disgust response either will go away on its own, or if it doesn't, that's okay too. They can handle it. They're not going to fall apart. They're not going to die from being so anxious. So safety learning teaches two things: that the initial feared association, the pairing of that stimulus or situation, and danger that led to the development of the conditioned fear response is not accurate anymore. And in fact, there's all this new learning that when you stay in a situation and don't escape, nothing bad happens. You're learning that that situation is safe. And also that your fear response to that situation isn't conveying any information about danger, which is what fear is supposed to do and what fear usually does. In the case of a phobia, we're having basically a false fear response. We're afraid of something that's not dangerous. So through exposure, we're learning to kind of safely ignore that fear. So in the activity for today, I'm going to have us in a second watch another video of a patient talking about her phobia. And as a group, we're going to try to identify some of the phobic fears that she talks about. She has more than one. In small groups, I'm going to have you choose one partner to role play as the patient. So try to put yourself in her shoes and imagine what would be scary to her based on the fears that she described. The other partner or partners will then ask the person role playing the patient questions like, what are you avoiding because of your fear? What's the worst thing that would happen if you didn't avoid? And identify at least 5 feared and avoided situations. The person role-playing as the patient is then going to rate each of those situations on a 0 to 100 scale based on their perception of how scary that would be to someone with that phobia. You'll list the 5 situations in order of how high the person role-playing the patient rates their anticipated fear in that situation, again, as the patient. Then working together, the patient and the other partners will design an exposure to target one of those feared or avoided situations. So an exposure is deliberately putting yourself in a situation that you know will cause anxiety to help promote safety learning. So you know that you'll have an anxiety response, but you also know that it will be a false alarm. So instead, what you'll learn is that being in that situation is safe and that your anxiety will naturally decline on its own. If we have time, I'll then ask everyone to switch roles and, working with the other fear, create another exposure hierarchy and design another exposure. And for the exposures that you design, identify what safety learning you want to take place, what expectation you're hoping to disprove, whether that's that something terrible will happen or that I just won't be able to tolerate my anxiety. Figure out what hypothesis you're testing, what you're trying to prove wrong. Okay, so here is the video.
The first time I really experienced fear was when I first went on an airplane. I was probably 9 years old, and once we took off and I realized how high in the air we were, I had to go to the washroom and I couldn't stand up from my seat because I thought that I would fall through the floor. My name is Ruth Ann, and I have 2 specific phobias. One is a fear of heights, and the other is a fear of enclosed spaces. I've never had a bad experience in an elevator ever. I just feel very uncomfortable knowing that I can't get out when I want to get out. When I'm faced with the fear of heights or of claustrophobia, I feel paralyzed. I feel like I can't move. I can't do anything to help myself if I fall or if I'm stuck. It's kind of the feeling of helplessness. And that comes with accelerated heart rate. I'll get all clammy. My hands will get sweaty. My feet will get sweaty. I'll get really, really hot. And then once I'm relieved of the stress, I'll get super cold and shaky. So it's all really physical.
People use the term phobia very, very casually, but in reality, a phobia is a problem where you're anxious about a particular situation and it causes so much difficulty in your life that you have a lot of distress or a lot of interference with your functioning. It turns out that phobias and specific phobias cause more interference than expected with people, actually, and they're, again, very common.
When other people would see my physical symptoms or physical reaction to a specific phobia, like enclosed spaces or heights, I would be really embarrassed, and people don't often understand. They're like, oh, you can't drive in heavy traffic? Oh, you can't get on an elevator? And it seems so trivial and silly. So then that in itself embarrasses me, and it makes me not want to try those things in front of people because I feel like I'm going to be judged.
All anxiety problems, it turns out that the most powerful aspect of the treatment is what we call facing your fear. So when people face any fear they have repeatedly, even a worry or something that hasn't happened or is unlikely to happen, if they face it repeatedly, we're built actually so that the anxiety goes down.
When I went to Toronto, I wanted to go up the CN Tower. It took me about probably an hour and a half to get on the elevator. And I went up and I made myself look out the window without covering my eyes, and I didn't try and take control of the situation. I just let myself be vulnerable. And once I was up there, I was like, oh, I did it. Okay, cool. And now every time I get in an elevator, it's like, well, if you could go up the CN Tower, you can get in the 6th floor elevator. Getting through a fear is facing it. Once you face it and realize that you can do it, makes you so much less afraid of it.
Part of my job as a psychologist is to help people break these problems down into gradual steps so it's not overwhelming to them to face their fear. You want to make it comfortable for them so that they can see progress and make a commitment to take on the treatment.
I've realized that if you don't go through anxiety, there's no other way around it. I think the best help that I ever got was just talking out loud to someone who understands. You realize that everything is validated and that you're not crazy and that you'll be fine. Just trying means you're going somewhere.
Okay, so in this activity, you're going to be either role playing as somebody with these fears, a fear of heights and a fear of enclosed spaces, or as a therapist trying to help them develop an exposure hierarchy. So list a series of activities they could engage in, situations they could put themselves in to challenge one of the fears associated with claustrophobia and fear of heights. So in this activity, the person role playing as a therapist is going to ask questions to try to understand what situations the patient has been avoiding. So in the elevator fear example, so fear of elevators is kind of a specific focal fear that someone with fear of heights and claustrophobia might have. So when it comes to elevators, you can ask what kinds of activities related to elevators have you been avoiding? Being in them. You want to know what the patient thinks would happen if they didn't avoid, like what would happen if they got into an elevator. It sounds like for this person, her fear is being stuck somewhere that she can't easily leave. So what's the worst case scenario that would happen if she's stuck somewhere she can't leave? What would make that scenario so bad and so scary? Once you've identified about 5 situations that they've been avoiding, you want to have the patient use a scale like this one, the subjective units of distress scale, to rate how scary they would find it in character as the patient. So higher SUDs, higher subjective units of distress, means that that situation would make them way more anxious, and it should go higher on the scale. As the therapist in that video said, when we're doing exposure therapy with a patient, just like with the cockroaches, we usually start somewhere in the middle. So we want it to cause some anxiety so that they get to actually experience mastery over anxiety and they get to see what happens if they put themselves in an anxiety-provoking situation without avoiding. But we don't generally go right to the top of people's hierarchies right away. Patients don't want to do it. So if this patient were making a hierarchy related to her fear of elevators, she said that going to the top of this skyscraper in Toronto was scarier. It was higher on the hierarchy, it was higher on the SUD scale than something like a 6-story elevator ride. But a 6-story elevator ride would both be scary for her. So maybe the CN tower would be like a 90 on the SUD scale, and a 6-story elevator ride would be a 70, something that would make her pretty anxious and she would have a hard time functioning in that situation, but not as bad as going to the top of a skyscraper. When you're designing an exposure, what you want to do is plan for the patient to encounter a feared situation and plan for them not to avoid it. And the reason you're doing this is to create safety learning, to create inhibitory learning. At a neural level, where their nervous system is going to pair that experience with safety, but also at a conscious level, where they are seeking the answers to a question. They're testing a hypothesis about the likelihood of a feared outcome happening, or they're testing how bad it would be if that thing did happen. So for her, she described one exposure scenario as riding to the top of the CN tower without covering her eyes and looking out the window. So not only was she putting herself in that situation, she was doing some things that she knew might make it more anxiety provoking, not avoiding the experience by covering her eyes or not looking out the window. Okay, so that is that, and I'll answer any questions that you have about this in class.